Let's talk about statistical thinking.
When we're conducting a statistical analysis of data that we've collected, or if we're analyzing a statistical analysis done by someone else, here are some factors we should consider. First, the context of the data, the source of the data, the sampling method, conclusions, and practical implications. When we talk about the context of the data, here's some questions to ask. What do the values represent? Where did the data come from? Why was the data collected? And we do this because an understanding of the context will directly affect the statistical procedure that we use. When we think about the source of the data, we want to ask if the source is objective or if it's biased. And would there be any incentive for those collecting the data to distort or spin results to support some self-serving position? Is there something to gain or lose by distorting results? And we want to be vigilant and skeptical of studies from sources that might be biased. Another thing to consider is the sampling method. Sample data has to be collected in an appropriate way, such as through a process of random selection. We'll talk more about this later. When we're thinking about the sampling method, we want to ask, does the method chosen greatly influence the validity of the conclusion? Another thing to think about is that voluntary response or self-selected samples often have bias because those with a special interest are more likely to participate. These samples' results are not necessarily valid. Other methods are more likely to produce good results. And when we talk about a voluntary response or a self-selected sample, we mean a sample where the respondents were able to choose whether or not to respond or not. For example, if you get a phone call with someone wanting you to answer a survey, you can choose whether to respond or not. Or if you get a survey in the mail, you can choose whether to send it back or not. Most of the time, people only respond to those types of surveys if they have some kind of strong opinion or strong feeling about the topic. That's why we say that they often have bias. We also need to think about conclusions. If we're writing conclusions, we need to consider our audience. Where appropriate, make statements that are clear to those without an understanding of statistics and its terminology. And avoid making statements not justified by the statistical analysis. If we're looking at someone else's study and their conclusions, this is what we need to think about. Are the conclusion statements that they made justified by their statistical analysis or not? We can also look at the practical implications of certain studies, especially if we're conducting a study. One question we would want to ask is, does the finding make enough of a difference to justify its use or to be practical? There might be some statistical significance without any practical significance. In other words, it might be a great study, but not useful for anything practical. In this course, we'll talk about statistical significance quite a bit. What we need to do is consider the likelihood of getting the result by chance. And then if the results could easily have occurred by chance, then they're not statistically significant. If the likelihood of getting the results by chance is very small, then the results are statistically significant. Let's look at an example of a data set. This was a data set I found in StatCrunch called the Body Image Data Set. And the information available in StatCrunch just said that a student survey was conducted at a major university. Data were collected from a random sample of 239 undergraduate students. Here were the variables given in the data set. So we have gender, height, GPA, high school GPA, seat, weight, feel, and cheat. Looking at these descriptions of the variables, you can get an idea of what type of data was being collected in this survey. Let's think about some questions to consider. First of all, what is the difference in this study between the population, the sample, and an individual? The population represented would be all undergraduates at the major university. because the sample was 239 undergraduate students. So the population represented would have to be undergraduates. And the sample is the 239 students that actually did respond to the survey. An individual in this data set would be each student that responded, and it would be represented by one row of the data set with all of those variables that were in the list of variables. Another question to think about is, why wasn't the survey given to all undergraduates? Then we could have had information about the whole population instead of just a sample. Most of the time, it's just not possible to get information on an entire population. In this case, at a university, it would probably be possible to get some information about the entire undergraduate population, but with the questions that were asked in the survey, it is likely to have been either too time-consuming or too expensive to get the survey to all the undergraduates and get them all to return it. Another question we could think about is, what could have been the goal of this study? Just from the information that was collected, I would guess that the goal was to find out whether body image, seating preference, and some of those other variables are related, and to learn about the entire undergraduate population by making inferences based on the sample. Now let's think about some of those factors that we discussed earlier. The context of the data. We know what the values represent and where the data came from, but not exactly why it was collected. We can make an educated guess, which is what we were doing when we were talking about the possible goal of this study. The source of the data and the sampling method, because the information in StatCrunch was pretty vague, the only thing we really know is that the sample was random and that it came from a major university. For the practical implications, again, we can make an educated guess about what this information might be used for. So, for example, the results of this study could be used to develop programs for undergraduates, such as body image support groups.